The aristocratic women have always had a high position, even in Jahiliyyah. So there's some exaggeration, I think, in amongst some of the ulama about how bad it was. But the aristocratic women were very powerful. They always are. In every civilization, women find a way. Women have always found ways of expressing their power. In the Kaydukunna Azim, one of the things that they say about that is that when women are prevented from a kind of ability to assert their power openly, they find other strategies of doing it, and that's where the kaid comes. And as one of the Moroccan faqihat said, kaid is also an attribute of God. So it's not necessarily always a negative thing. It's people find ways to assert their authority. But many women, especially the more impoverished, and we shouldn't forget that Arabia was a very impoverished area. Mecca was a fruitful area, Medina was a fruitful area, but many people lived in what we would call today abject poverty. There was a lot of starvation. Clothes were very expensive, textiles, these type of things. So a lot of people wear rags. We know about Sahaba that they would run after the prayer back to their home, and then the Prophet asked them why they would do it, and they said the wife needed his ridaf to cover her nakedness because she didn't have enough cloth. So we kind of forget about the environment. We're so spoiled and in such a cornucopia of wealth, and that's one of the signs that the Prophet told us about the latter days, is that there would be an explosion of wealth. And one of the things he said was that there would be a lot of food, which is very interesting, because historically the Muslims were encouraged by the Prophet ﷺ to have at least a year's supply of dry foods in their homes, and he kept that. It would be exhausted during the year because he would give it out to the fuqara and the masakin, but it was his sunnah to actually have supplies in the home for famine, because famine was so common in many places until very recently. It still is in certain places, but it's not because of in the past. That has to do with just bad distribution. 200 years ago, Algeria sent bumper crops to France during one of their famines. So the Muslims used to send aid to non-Muslim countries. We know that Turkey sent a huge several shiploads of wheat to Ireland during the potato famine that was prevented from getting there by the British because they didn't want to look bad. So they actually stopped the ships. So the Turks had to smuggle food in. So, we don't think about that type of difficulty that people had. So inheritance, wealth is always a problem. وَمَنْ يُوقَ شُحَّ نَفْسِهِ. The nafs is shahih by nature, and shuh is bukhlun shadid. And when Allah says وَمَنْ يُوقَ, so it's in a passive form, like the one who doesn't prevent himself, but he's prevented from his own greed. So greed is part of human nature, and people get very strange around money. The Arabs say, al-malu shaqiqun nafs. Wealth is the blood brother of the soul. So there are people that find it harder to part with wealth than they do with their own lives, which is why sometimes we have suicides when people lose vast amounts of wealth. It's as if they died. I think there are a lot of rules in Sharia that were designed to give women a type of independence, because the dominant dependence that a woman, especially women in the childbearing years, the dominant dependence that they have on men is money. That الرجال قوامون على النساء. They are the maintainers of women, and that is a natural order, and it has been for millennia. One of the things that fascinates me, and even though there's a khilaf about this, but in the Malikis, khidma batina for a woman is generally, unless she's like an aristocratic type woman, then the husband has to provide help for her in the house. But for normal women, she can actually charge her husband for domestic service. And I think it's only recently in the last 40 or 50 years that economists started thinking about actually women's contribution to the GDP inside the homes. Like, it wasn't really factored in. They just took all this labor that's done without any monetary exchange, whereas Islam, was already considering this 1,400 years ago. It's one of the many things that the West kind of catches up on. It takes them usually about 1,000, maybe give or take 200 or 300 years, like slip-on shoes. My own family, grandparents' side, they were very wealthy. It wasn't true for my generation, but for my grandparents' generation and my great-grandparents. But the money was destroyed by fighting over the wills, and lawyers took a huge amount of my maternal grandfather's legacy, because they split over the will. And I think that's one of the things that destroys families, is fighting over. I mean, you must see this all the time. And so I think that's part of the hikmah, because this is one of the few areas in the Sharia. There is some difference of opinion, but it's relatively small.
It's remote.
It's remote, and like residual, like Malikis put it into the public, the Bayt al-Mal, things like that. But they're very small and don't occur that often. This is an area where the Quran clearly defines, who gets a half, who gets a third, who gets 1/8, who gets 1/4, who gets 2/3. I mean, all that's defined very clearly. And then it's also, if you look, it has a primary inheritors are to preserve that solid family. And then the secondary ones, it's the extended family. Vivek Ramaswamy has been talking a lot about how central the nuclear family is. The nuclear family is already a broken family. Like, people don't think about that. The nuclear family is the remnant of what was once real family. And Zimmerman, in his book on civilization and family, he argues that there's 3 types of families. There's a clan family, which governments do not like, because they present threats to governments. And when you have like the Mujaddidi clan in Afghanistan, that is a serious clan, and they have clients. Or the Katani in Morocco was a threat to the government. I mean, the Mullah Abdul Hafid actually had one of them killed because he was so worried about the threat that he presented. But then you have what he called the domestic family, and that is the best family, which is an extended family with uncles and aunts and cousins, because it takes the burden of government in taking care when families break down. According to Zimmerman, he wrote this in 1947. He was a Harvard sociologist. And he said the nuclear family was the worst form of family, because the burden on the government when it broke up was immense. One of my teachers said that fundamental maqsad of the Sharia, we have the 6, but of all of them, really after Deen, the most important one is preservation of family, because if that breaks down, everything else breaks down. And so if you look at the hadith of when Iblis sends his saraya out, right? So when they come back, he said, ماذا صنعت? What did you do? He said, فعلت كذا وكذا. He said, ما صنعت شيئا. You didn't do anything. And then one of them says, ما تركته حتى فرقت بينه وبين زوجته. And he said, نعم أنت فأدناه. So I thought about that hadith, and I realized he's a metaphysician, Iblis. He was going to first causes, like murder, you didn't do anything. Stealing, you didn't do anything. Theft, but you do that, you get everything else. You get all of that social dysfunction. And that's what he knew. And so inheritance is fundamentally to preserve the family from breaking up over something as insignificant as property in terms of our hearts.